So what I want to spend some time talking about today is a recent connectivity analysis that we were recently contracted to conduct for Arizona Department of Game and Fish. It was a fairly tight turnaround on this report that you see here. We were brought on board in May of last year and turned this report in 3 hours shy of the deadline. So I was really happy that I actually had a little bit of a cushion in that. I was fairly impressed with myself at that. So I've got to acknowledge the funding from Arizona Game and Fish and these other partners that contributed to what you'll see here. So I want to provide you a little project context, and I don't want to get too into the weeds with this. I can put it in perspective for you later on. But this is all part of Arizona's State Wildlife Action Plan revision process. And in so doing, Game and Fish has developed a spatial web development tool and a series of spatial models called the Species Habitat and Conservation Guide. And the whole purpose of this is to put resource management conservation data in the hands of people so that they can integrate this in the planning process. So as part of the SHCG, they've created several submodels to work through developing data sets that inventory these critical factors throughout the state to be addressed in conservation planning, transportation purposes, those types of things. Parallel to this is a really interesting initiative that's also occurring with the Western Governors Association. So the governors for the 19 western states have gotten together and they've formed an action plan of things ranging everything from economic development to conservation prioritization. Those SHCG Tier 1 data sets that you had seen on the previous slide were the information that the Western governors were interested in obtaining to formalize a formal blueprint for conservation of all Western states. So that's a key part of what Game and Fish is working on. Where we fit into this process is with the connectivity analysis portion of this. The Western governors have also asked for individual states to develop a connectivity assessment for those states. So we were brought on board to complete this final Tier 1 data set for the state of Arizona. So let's talk a little bit about what we had to do in order to accomplish this. The first piece was to develop in connectivity modeling what we call this cost surface, the surface of the landscape that we're going to utilize to parameterize the movement of species. So in our case here, this was a landscape integrity data set. Now these are very similar to a number of other indices and analysis that are out there. Ecological integrity assessments, indices of biotic integrity. This is very analogous to what we had seen yesterday with the Yellowstone example and the data that we were seeing there. So these are all very relatable methods and processes that are well documented. So we were simply employing some of those here. Once we have our initial surface, then we can get to the real meat of this matter and start to look at some of the connectivity issues for the state. So we employed a number of methods to identify what we're calling important connectivity zones. And that varies a little bit from specific modeled corridors. I'll get into that a little bit later, but it's a statewide perspective for those pieces. So putting this into context, landscape integrity can really be thought of a gradient of human disturbance, right? Where we can have a highly built system on one end of the spectrum and a highly natural system on the other end of the spectrum. So what we do in a landscape integrity assessment is we start to simply obtain all of the readily available data that we have, inventorying the infrastructure that we've built on the surface of the planet. As we add the infrastructure, we then subtract that from landscape integrity. So it's a simple inverse in a very simple way. And so we're making the generalizable assumption that as the landscape is more built, the integrity of that landscape from an ecological sense has diminished to some degree. So this is different, though, than what we had seen yesterday with the Yellowstone example, in that this particular analysis that we've conducted lacks specific data to truly inventory the health of a system through things like biomass and small mammal inventories, those types of things. Those are all very difficult data sets to obtain for an entire state scale. So that's why they're not able to be included here. But lots of folks are utilizing this as an effective proxy for what we were looking at. So landscape integrity. This is the stuff we build, the stuff that is pervasive throughout Arizona, factors that are readily available in the short time frame that we had, that we can start to inventory to develop this human footprint and or landscape integrity. So the process that you move through is actually quite simple in that we determine the landscape impacts from these factors, right? So imagine meetings every other week, reviewing the literature, culling through this with resource managers. What are the impacts of pipelines on the landscape, those types of things. Coming to a consensus and building a model around those things. We then determine at what distance in the landscape we would expect those impacts to persist, and then ultimately translate those into impact scores for the additive model that we're looking at. So in doing this, there's really two primary components to each of those factors that we were looking at. One is a measure of impact related to the distance or proximity from, say, a road centerline or a pipeline, right? And in this particular case, we utilize fuzzy logic classification to help parameterize the impact to diminish with distance. And I'll talk about in the next slide why that's a really neat advancement. And I think we all ought to be utilizing these fuzzy logic classes in lots of the modeling we're doing, because it's not as discrete as we would believe necessarily. So the point of fuzzy logic, though, is it deals in approximations rather than exact measures, right? So we can all logically infer that the impact from a road is going to be bigger as we're close to that road, and it will diminish with distance. At what distance it moves from a score of 5 to 3, that's something we don't know, but we can infer that it's some sort of curve. So it's useful for phenomena that don't have set boundaries, such as habitat modeling, and in our case here, modeling impacts around features. Science-based approach to modeling imprecise or unknown information, really. The second piece that's built into each of these factors is a density component. This is a measure that we've integrated so that we can put some value on the intensity of the features. Areas where we have a much higher road density, the impacts from those roads are expected to be greater. Okay, so that's another measure that we can integrate into this. So this is that difference between the discrete classification and fuzzy logic like I talked about. We can take and assume that impacts are going to be greatest at a particular feature and fit that to some curve to diminish with distance. What that allows us to do is it unshackles us from determining at what intermediate distances our scores need to change. So it's a nice way to bring in these gradients that we know to occur in nature and apply that with this here. So remember the 18 or so factors from the previous slide. Each of these were developed into conceptual models, how we're going to be framing what we'll look at in the spatial context with regards to what attributes we have available at the statewide scale, those types of things. And then the model scales in complexity based on the data that we have in those things. Behind the scenes of this is there's a more complex model builder model associated with each of these. It includes all of the geoprocessing steps to get us through these workflows. So these conceptual models and the underlying submodels are all developed for these factors to ultimately move towards inventorying impacts, overlaying these things to deduce landscape integrity. So here's an example of canals, for example. The canals located in a few areas here. This is actually the Central Arizona project, bringing Colorado River water through the desert into Arizona and some smaller agricultural canals. This is what the typical output of that simple submodel would look like, right, where we're quantifying impacts. Areas in red, we're expecting to have higher landscape impacts than areas in green. So you can see the distance functions, different distance functions based on the intensity of that infrastructure. CAP is much larger, it's wider, bigger impact, and you can also see the density functions playing out where canals start to then overlap. This is but one factor in many. This is the ultimate landscape integrity surface for that particular neck of the woods. And so you can see now canals are but one factor. So all of these factors were vetted within Game and Fish, talked with resource managers to get an understanding of how they should be weighted in all of those materials. If you're interested in the weeds of that process, I'll send you to the 90-page report that I just finished, and you can take a look at that. So another example, land cover, right? Our conceptual model, taking this information, very simple at this point, we're reclassifying this into impact scores, converting it into then one layer of many in landscape integrity. Final example here, in mines. This is an interesting one in that we have extracted open pit mines from some of the Southwest Regional Gap Analysis data. We also have point data from Bureau of Mines. Put this into the submodel, we start to get ideas of density impacts and then get an understanding of how that plays its role in the overall landscape integrity. So all of these things together, and we're able to create a surface now, which is Arizona's landscape integrity, right? So we equate this to being a human footprint map, right? Here we have Phoenix, my neck of the woods down here in Tucson, and the remainder of the Arizonan landscape. So one of the things that we had to do earlier in the process was get a sense of how well our data product was stacking up to some of the previous analysis of these types of things. So Sanderson et al. had developed a human global footprint with 1 kilometer resolution. Liu et al. Had done human footprint for the West. David Theobald was working with this in the West as well. The Western Governors Association has done some of this stuff. So what we wanted to do is to take our landscape integrity surface and vet it against these data products from these peers. It's a big problem, actually. The state of Arizona is a big area. We can't compare these things on a cell-by-cell basis because there are different resolutions. Ours is at 30 meters. The most coarse is at 1 kilometer cells. So what we had done is we had to aggregate our data up and aggregate some of the other data down. So we divided the state into some just under 3 million individual hexes we aggregated, and then we're able to run a correlation on that then to determine how well our data product is stacking up to the others. So we have robust statistical correlation with these things, but a point that I want to make clear is that we don't want perfect correlation, right? There's lag here in terms of the data and what's transpired from when this was conducted in 2002 to present day. And moreover, the factors that we're looking at for this analysis are specific to the needs of Arizona, right? So that's different than how some of these other folks had modeled this information. So one of the things that's interesting about a data set like this then is that we can utilize it to identify these areas that we call last of the wild. Right? So these are those portions throughout the landscape that exhibit high landscape integrity and are largely contiguous and intact. So this, in and of itself, can be a very useful product for planning, conservation purposes to identify those critically last wild places throughout the state. That's not the end game, though. For us here, we're interested in this mess, the connectivity throughout the state of Arizona. So let me talk a little bit about what we have here. We utilized a tool called the Connectivity Analysis Toolkit, developed by Carlos Carroll. And this is a set of geographic tools outside of ARC in its own GUI that looks at connectivity in a number of ways, in a graph theoretic way, a circuit theory way, and in more traditional least cost methods. All of these tools are available to us. In consultation with Game and Fish, we decided on a shortest path betweenness centrality metrics for that. So what we do in this case is we take the entire state of Arizona, we cut it into little hexagons. In this case, these are actually 1 kilometer hexagons that you're seeing here. This is a little inset from my area of the woods down here by Tucson. We cut the state into these 1 kilometer hexagons, and then we start to experiment with what are the connections to connect this hexagon with this hexagon, this one with this one, this one with this one, all 294,000 of these pairwise, each direction, multi-times, millions and millions of iterations. The output of that then, behind the scenes, puts a tally on each of these hexagons. How many times was that hexagon used as part of one of those least cost paths? So what you're looking at here is the final piece, the summation of those hexagons, how many times they were part of one of those optimal paths. These areas in green are high flow. Those hexagons were critical to many solutions between all of those pairs. These areas in rusty red were less critically important. So in doing this, now, we can start to get an understanding of what role this particular portion of the landscape plays for connectivity of the whole. That's the power of this graph theoretic version of this, in that it allows us to prioritize connectivity for the entire state as opposed to simply modeling it between point A and point B. Here we've modeled it between hundreds of thousands of point A's and point B's. So we need to untangle this a little bit for the stakeholders to implement what we're actually looking at here. So one of the first steps in doing so is to simply extract out those areas that are most critically important. Consultation with Game and Fish, and through running multiple versions of this, we ultimately selected the top 10% of these connectivity values, right? Thresholds are always a tricky thing to work with, but nonetheless they give us a starting point here. These models are all such that we can adjust those as we need to. These are the top 10% areas. So what we have here then, as you can see, we have a largely connected network, right? But there's lots of local fragmentations within this. So we need to take additional editing in order to create this comprehensive network in this. So in doing so, we developed a set of rules to go back to the original output and then take the next best solution, select that hex, and continue on until it terminates by meeting one of the original top 10%. When we do that, then we get a completely connected network for the entire state, whereas there are no dead ends within the network. Everything connects to something else by building in those next best options. And of course, we can annotate which were the top 10% and which were edited. That was, as is the case here. One of the beautiful things about this then is each hex also retains its original value and its role within the state. So we can then symbolize that network and get an understanding of really how important that particular area is compared to that particular area, right? So it's a prioritization metric which we can throw money behind, we can throw planning efforts behind, those types of things to get an understanding of where might our attention best be served here. So I'll bring in the last of the wild here again, those large, highly integral blocks that are large in size, and we start to get an idea of what a connected network of largely natural and largely natural connections between them might start to look like. But now again, remember, this is an analysis that was running connectivity of the whole. It was done independent of these protected areas or these blocks of high integrity. We're simply overlaying them here. So ultimately, this then is where we're going with this, so that we can start to identify and provide some prioritization for which areas are most important for the entire state of Arizona then. So what I want to do now then is to break away from the Game and Fish report, which is what you had just seen there, and talk a little bit about how we can utilize those types of analyses in scenario planning and utilize these types of tools to vet the decisions or development prospects that we may be looking at. So again, this is my neck of the woods. This is the city of Tucson with the landscape integrity surface that was previously developed. Bring in those important connectivity zones, and this is that little area that was always in the inset down in this particular portion. So from a statewide perspective, this little strip of the earth just north of Tucson is important for connectivity in the entire network in the entire state. So I want to start to understand what would happen if development changes in this area and how that might have cascading effects then and impacting connectivity. So now we're operating at a different scale. We need to utilize different tools. The CAT analysis, the large graph for the entire state, works really well for large landscapes, but we have better tools for modeling connections between protected areas or habitat patches at finer scales. So folks that had seen my talk last year, this is an example that I like to work with a lot in my classes and like to talk about in rooms like this. We have the city of Tucson, and then we have Saguaro National Park West and Saguaro National Park East. These are two of our ultimate national treasures, and they're in close proximity here. So the logical question is, well, what about connecting these areas? So I like to use that as an example. So now we're at a finer scale, and we start to utilize a different tool for modeling connections between those areas. So this is a circuit theory-based approach now, which is actually modeling the flow of what we call random walkers as they disperse from point A to point B. We release millions of random walkers, which by the way are analogous to agents, and we again sum up how many times each of those random walkers encounters a particular grid cell. Those areas in green are areas where lots of random walkers have accumulated in those cells, and thus these are the connections that we're looking at to get from Saguaro East to Saguaro West. Not so much in the urban areas, right, and south. We can then run this through something that might look familiar, a least cost path, right? That's the snake of the way through there. So what we wanted to look at, this is state A, right, as it stands currently, present day, in Tucson. What happens then if we have a nice new development that would come into this particular area, right? So this is very conceptual at this point. We had run these things just a handful of days before coming out here. But so now we can put that in. We can reparameterize the landscape integrity surface, and now you'll notice that connection that was once there, the flow, is now being diverted. And it's actually being diverted in a very circuitous way, right? Not very biologically robust way around this. So we can then test the impacts of different development types and how that would have impacts on connectivity then. Okay, so that was an example of just adding a one new development to the existing landscape, a human footprint. What if we take and simulate all of the urban area in and around Tucson, expanding slightly? That's another really interesting use of a surface like we've created. That can be the input for growth simulations. So that's what we've done here. We've taken that surface, we've expanded the growth through a simulation, we've run it through the model again, and as Tucson and its neighboring municipalities continue to expand, well, now we're in a completely different ballgame. Now the areas south of Tucson and beyond are becoming important for these types of connections. So what we look at then in a class that I teach, Geodesigning Landscape Linkages, is we can take these scenarios and we can manipulate them, right, in a way that can maintain some of these connections. And we can work with that then in densities, configurations, right, land use types, infrastructure provisions, to ultimately work with what we have, right, so that we're not completely fragmenting this landscape. So now I'm just going to zoom in here again. It's really to this area to show you how this changed over time, right? So this was our initial flow connection. As we add that development, this is now cut off. We have a very tight bottleneck, and as we simulate growth expanding entirely, now we've completely cut off that once viable connection between these areas. So this is a way that we can simulate the impacts of wildlife connectivity in a sense like this. So I'll leave you with some of my closing thoughts. This was a big one for me last year, and it holds true. We need to do a better job of translating science, things like connectivity conservation and wildlife biology, into things that land use planners and designers can understand, right? So that we can know what science tells us will happen, right, to those biological communities if development proceeds in a particular way. So we need to serve as translators in that arena, and that's one of the things that I try to do in my work. This first sentence goes without saying, right? We've seen multiple times that these simulations can be very useful in evaluating the impacts. The second piece is what I feel very strongly about, right? I want to make that mistake in the digital world, in my model, so that we can avoid making it in the real world. That's the point of going through these types of scenarios. While these things are often data-driven, right, it's their decision-driven components and outcomes that ought to be the focus of the process, as was the collaborative process for us with game and fish. Such outcomes then ought to be evaluated within the context of project-specific metrics and their impacts on the whole, perhaps this Bill of Rights that we've been talking about lately. That's very easy to compare those to a set of metrics that we could develop here. And then finally, this geodesign framework that Carl and others talk about really fits very nicely into conservation planning in terms of providing a replicable conceptual workflow. The methods, however, the specific tools that I utilize as somebody that models connectivity are going to vary from the GeoDesign tools that somebody else may use. So they're discipline specific, such as those applied here. And that's our job then, to equip the new young professionals and the new thinkers about what types of tools they ought to be putting in their tool belts as they work forward in solving these problems. So with that, again, I thank my research students and thank you all for your time. Thank you.